So the idea of metaphysics, how that works in life, the law of vibration, and getting to understand how you can attune yourself to that like you would attune through a musical instrument. So that musical instrument was the practical reality of what we do metaphysically, I think.
So I agree with you. And that's ultimately what we're talking about here. So the reason why the drums work well for it is because our let's first preface by saying that speech, those who have mastered rhetoric, right, and grammar, can more easily elucidate meaning, right? We can communicate better if we pick the right words. But ultimately, language limits us. If I could just get you to feel the way that I feel and understand what I'm thinking, I would be a lot more easy than having to figure out a way to put it into words, right? It's a challenge for me to put it into words, and then that's got to be communicated. And then in order for communication to happen, you've got to interpret my meaning, right? But when we were more primitive, we communicated with percussion. Our vocalizations were percussive and rhythmic. So it's actually instinctual for us to communicate in that way. Animals do it. I mean, you don't have to make a great leap to understand that we weren't eloquent, right? We weren't orators 200,000 years ago.
Sure.
Maybe some of our ancestors. But fundamentally, humans, whether you believe that we were put here, whatever form you believe that we got here to this place, we've become more eloquent over time. I think it would be fair to say. The drums are simple. They're primitive, they're rhythmic, they're percussive. And so it's simple enough for me to hit a beat, expect you to listen to it, and then copy it. That's call and response. There's call and response in all of our interactions. We're doing it right here while we're having a conversation with each other. I wouldn't want to play drum over your rhythm, just like I wouldn't want to speak over you when we're interacting in a conversation. It's important for the kids that I teach to learn that, and it was important that day for some of the guys in your lodge to learn that, amongst some of the other lessons that modality can teach. But ultimately, yes, we're talking about energy, right? Because, I mean, you said music, right? I mean, it's music. Music is the art of energy, right? You and I debated the other day about how involved math is. And that nature ultimately isn't precisely mathematical. But for the most part, rhythm, pattern, frequency, everything is waves, everything is energy. We understand now that we're electromagnetic beings. We know that. There's one of the benefits of modern technology, of Reels and Instagram and TikTok and all that, is that more people are watching these videos that are tapping into what have been givens for a long time, would have been well known in ancient mysteries, and that is that everything is frequency, that nature operates at a frequency. I watched a video of Sir David Attenborough talking about a bee and a flower, and how the bee moves to the flower, and it actually changes the frequency with which the flower's vibrating when the pollen's electrons jump to the bee and cling to the bee, and then when the bee leaves, the frequency of the flower has now changed so that other bees know that there's no pollen there left over. To think that bees and birds and flowers are operating based on frequencies and we as humans are not, I think would be silly or maybe ignorant. You walk into a room and you meet a person with a certain energy, and people turn their heads. You remember that person, they make an imprint on you. That's not about what things they said, but the way that they made you feel, right? It's the way that experiences make you feel.
Well, and I think for somebody that doesn't understand that concept, if you ever walk into a space and you feel a bad vibe.
There you go.
Or you feel like...
Or in your gut.
Yeah, exactly. There's something off about this person. It's like, I don't know, that person's peculiar or awkward or whatever else.
Something's weird about this.
Exactly. This guy over here.
So Thomas Ubriaco, past master of Essex Lodge number 7 in Caldwell, New Jersey, buddy, says music is pure math. He is a music teacher.
Oh.
Yeah. And he also knows the Fellcraft lecture, which gets it.
It's my favorite.
It is my favorite as well. That and doing the Royal Arch Principal Sojourner part. Those two, I think, they're remarkably similar.
Yeah.
because there's a lot of walking and talking.
Okay.
But
I hope they're similar in more ways than walking and talking.
that's mostly how they're similar.
Lecture is
Yeah.
so beautiful.
No, the content is very different.
Yeah, very different.
But yes, I agree. I think that math is but math is an interesting one because math is the map, not the territory, right? So humanity, and a buddy of mine, Ramsey, who's sorry if I'm jumping around, but I'm trying to connect several things here.
And I think it's awesome that we have people.
Yeah, they can weigh in. This is our first live show. Thanks, guys, for watching.
Thanks for having me.
Very
Your
great.
first live show. Is that
This
cool?
is super awesome.
3 hours of the fire.
Yeah, that was
Absolutely.
good. Thanks again.
So, my buddy Ramsey said that, it's very interesting when you take the Pythagorean theorem, like the golden spiral and such,
yeah, Fibonacci sequence.
Fibonacci sequence, and you start to apply that, the 37th problem of Euclid and all of that, and you start to apply that to building principles, how humans build, you can get really far, and you do some fascinating things with it. When you then apply it to nature itself, you don't get very far because there aren't any straight lines in nature. Math is too neat for nature,
Right.
on certain respects, right? So it's, yes, music is created by humans, and as such,
Math is an homage to nature.
right.
Is really what we're talking about.
So music, just like math, and maybe all art, is our poor interpretation of the divine, right? Or what we see around us.
The more beautiful music doesn't necessarily land on every downbeat, right? I mean, the art comes out of respecting the math and putting your own flavor onto the math, right? Maybe I come in a 16th beat before every before every measure. So beautiful music, right, or complex, really interesting music, just like interesting art is not necessarily perfect lines and everything measured out with vantage points and perfect focal perspective. And I think that's what art is, right? Otherwise, we would just look at a piece of graph paper and think it's beautiful.
Yes.
But ultimately, it's the human touch or the natural touch. Because let's not forget, we are nature, right? It's our spin on the math. It's our spin on the concrete that makes it abstract. So yeah, I think we just agreed, right? Who knows?
Yeah, imagine that.
What happened there?
I don't know. Something very, very strange.
Your friend helped us.
So from a perspective of, behavioral nature, whatever else, how would you define, gender? How would you define?
You want to go there?
I think so. Why not?
We're going to go there now?
Okay.
Well, where do you want to go?
All right. Well, all right. Let's set this up a little bit then, at least.
Okay.
So one of the things that we like to talk about, we find interesting on Brothers of the Arcana, is we're all brothers. We come from the same fraternity. That fraternity, to a great extent, focuses on men's issues and the way that men can become better men. Through the use of, I think, on some level, sacred space, like ritual space, other things like that are available, and other things, also through a sense of community, also through shared interests like cigar smoking and bourbon drinking or Scotch drinking, whatever the case may be.
And essentially connecting to deity, becoming
Correct.
the best version of yourself.
Yes.
By awakening.
All of that. So our fraternity is open to men, and men only. So, it posits one of the ideas of what is a man? Because that's starting to not be such an easy question to answer. Whereas I think before is
begs the question: will we allow in a person who was born biologically female that has transitioned to male per our bylaws? Is that essentially where we're going here?
no. I don't want to go there. In fact,
No, definitely.
at all. That'll be a question possibly for the future and not to be discussed by us. What I was more interested in,
not as it relates to Masonry.
correct.
Okay.
So the larger piece would be, and you know what? Maybe on the other podcast we can have that conversation, which relates
Stuff for failure.
specifically for that. But no, my point was larger in essence than Masonry or any particular fraternity or organization. Was we're under an obligation to understand ourselves as men, and how we act upon society and teach other men how to become better men. So how do we do that with some of the modern tools that you've been able to bring along? And, amidst what I think is a great amount of confusion as far as what is gender, what is it to be a man in the modern day, and so on. So,
okay, so the reason you're asking me is because I'm a mental health professional.
yes, that's part of it. But you also have your that other bias of being a Mason and of being with other guys who are all trying to on their own levels figure out what that looks like for them, right? So it's not just an abstract, here's my clients and here's me. This is also, here's my brothers who are also sort of on some level struggling with this, or,
All right, well, gosh, that's profound. The question alone is profound. So thank you. So I'll say this, because there's a bunch of questions that I need to answer here, I believe. First, I'll say that the way that I have brought in new Masons so far, I have ideas, but the way that I've brought in new Masons so far is by being authentically me.
Mm-hmm.
The two guys that have been raised in my lodge was the gentleman that lives across the street from me and the guy that lives adjacent to me. So they spoke to me as neighbors. They interacted with me as neighbors, and they had questions like, "How are you this guy? Like, what you?" And I would tell them, and I would say, and I'm also part of this organization. And then they found themselves making their way over to the organization. I truly think, and it's not the chip on my shoulder speaking, but I think that that's really the way we should be doing it. We should be good men. We should walk the walk. We should be operative Masons, not just speculative Masons.
Okay, but what does that mean?
That's you don't want me to say that here.
I do. I want to know what it means for you.
What does it mean for me?
How does it show up for you?
So it means universal morality. It means being a good citizen. Mm-hmm. It means being a patriot. Mm-hmm. It means being a neighbor. It means being a caretaker. It means being a husband and a father, a friend, a brother, a son. It means giving people second chances. It means validating people's experiences. It means accepting people regardless of their perspective. It means validating people's unique experiences and not condescending. Mm-hmm. It means being egalitarian. It means all of those things. It means being a good human. So if we're talking about gender, mm-hmm. the easy answer is, I don't give a darn what you are. I love you. Mm-hmm. It's love. It's just love. Right. Whatever you are, whatever you're going through, I love you. You're worthy. You're valuable. Mm-hmm. If you're then asking, what has society done to compel people to believe that they need to explore their gender when they're 5 years old, mm-hmm. I would say that that's potentially dangerous, that mm-hmm. a child can look at TikTok and go down the rabbit hole without parental supervision and ask a question about their sexuality when they can't even contemplate yet what that means. Mm-hmm. It's not developmentally appropriate for them to even be having that conversation or be thinking about that.
Sure.
It's not to say that there are not likely kids who will have to walk that path, but their mind is not at the place yet where they can really explore that. So again, there's a lot of questions here. How deep do you want to go into this? Because I was a gender specialist for a little while. Regardless of my personal views about it, I knew that my job was, mind you, let me help your viewers understand that I was also a therapist, a clinical coordinator for juvenile sex offenders. Didn't mean that I wanted to validate or justify their actions.
Sure.
But I wanted to help them heal mm-hmm. so that less people were hurt, right? I did that for a few years. Actually, was the clinical coordinator of a transitional living home where I got those young men into school, graduating, joining the workforce, and in a lot of cases, decreasing recidivism. So that's, I believe, how we heal the world. It's not by condemning them, right?
No, I don't think anyone's talking about that per se, right?
Talking about that either. Sure. But functionally, I believe that. Do you want to go into the conversation we had earlier, like the biological component of this?
We can.
Absolutely. I think.
Or should we shift back to men's issues in general?
Well, I think from that perspective, we could also talk about what it is to be a man today. How do we overcome traumas? Because obviously there's an urban, or I don't know, I think at this point, there's so much pressure on men in society today.
Let me just take 2 seconds on exactly on Dave's point. So Brene Brown, familiar with her, right?
Absolutely.
I've read a lot of her stuff. Fascinating stuff. All about vulnerability, being vulnerable, coming from that space.
Yep.
There was a guy, he took his 2 daughters and wife to one of her book signings. Okay. And this is a story she tells, I think, pretty often. Most people probably are aware of it. But they all came up, got their book signed, everybody took pictures, and said, great. On their way out, the man stopped in, the father, and said, why don't you write a book about men?
Okay.
And she said, well, I mean, women are the vulnerable sex, and this is the problem, and, men are... And he had tears in his eyes, and he said, putting up the strong front for my daughters and for my wife, they get an opportunity to be vulnerable. I never do. So that part is killing guys on some level, because it's like saying you don't have an outlet, you don't have an opportunity. Potentially that's leading to strokes, heart attacks, all kinds of other things through lack of outlet in doing that. Obviously, the modern day is allowing all sorts of behavior that it wasn't allowing before. And we started talking about it's now creating spaces where that's not seen as quote unquote deviant behavior. It's now seen as okay, appropriate societal behavior.
Yes.
Whatever, you want to have pink hair, you want to have whatever piercings you want to have the 4th F with whoever you want. That's fine.
Well,
but
we were doing it for thousands of years before the Victorian era.
Right. And that's all fine. Yeah. But the point...
you're not infringing on others' rights.
Correct.
Or harming anyone.
Correct. No rape, obviously, or any untoward behavior.
Or even exposing minors or those without the capacity to understand. I mean, there's various forms of harm.
Pornography argument that we could potentially get into later, which is...
I don't think you'll have an argument.
No, just an understanding of that.
You're right.
But the larger piece is, and what's still taboo, and maybe one of the things Dave's getting at, and certainly Brene Brown said, was the ability for men to feel vulnerable.
Yeah.
And on some level, Masonry does give you that opportunity.
Yes.
Whereas in society, it's not okay. It's a huge taboo. Because if everybody felt vulnerable, then who's the guy on the wall with the machine gun watching for the Mongols, which are going to invade or whatever, if you're, let's say Han Chinese on the wall. So.
Okay. Beautiful. Again, guys, I appreciate this so much. This is awesome. So I had a conversation today when I was facilitating a guided meditation on this hike that I took this group of middle schoolers on. Mm-hmm. And I asked for a debrief afterwards. And one of the boys said, I felt powerful. I felt in control. I said, is that what? He said, no. I mean, I felt in control of me. I felt like I had control over myself, over my emotions. And I took that moment to talk about gender and masculinity a little bit, not any further than, than this, that
right.
It means to be a boy, and being strong and being powerful doesn't mean exerting your will over someone else or coercing anyone or dominating in every way or showing how strong you are or being arrogant or condescending or talking to somebody rudely to control the airwaves. It's about controlling yourself, right? The greatest warriors, we've talked about Wu Wei, Kung Fu masters, Bruce Lee, right? If you allow someone else's words to control you, then anyone has the ability to control you. The strongest men are those that are in control of their emotions. Those are not the men that don't allow for emotional release or catharsis. Those are the ones that allow for those things. I also want to mention that as you said, that times are changing. And I have a few examples of that, anecdotes from my own life. I shared earlier that I experienced existential crises. I studied theology, philosophy. I read all the masters. I read, the books of faith from so many different religions. And then I came back to my dad. I did. I came back to my dad eventually after years of, conflict. And now I have a good relationship with him. And he's evolved. He's an enlightened guy. Same thing with his dad. I had a conversation with his dad that went remarkably well. My uncles even told me at one point, don't waste your time. He won't change. This is who he is. I said, no, I have more faith in him than that. I think I know him really well. And he evolved, I think he would credit me to some degree. And it's really a beautiful thing. Actually, they're coming to visit my wife and my kids in a couple of weeks. I wouldn't have had them come and visit in the past, but now I'll be happy to receive them in my home where I'm vulnerable, right? where I'll be exposing my children to some of the same difficulties that I had to endure when I was a kid with these same people, except that I don't have any concerns anymore because of what I've assessed. So I mentioned the middle school and this trip that I took them out on today, hiking in the woods, mindfulness, meditation. There's a watering hole in Chester Township. It's beautiful. Actually, Mendham on the border. They swam a little bit, let the white water break up, positive ions. It was a beautiful thing. Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, deep breathing, and then this really great conversation, processing and debriefing and all that. And these middle schoolers have a male principal. This male principal, blue collar guy, happens to be a brilliant dude. He's also, he's like big guy, firm. He happens to be one of the gentlemen that is most in touch with who he is. Out of all the guys I think I've maybe ever met. And I got social worker friends who are very close to me, clinical supervisor and like best friend of mine, same kind of guy, Thich Nhat Hanh and Alan Watts guy, and Zen Buddhism, and this principal who comes from a blue collar family of plumbers, he gets it. He totally gets it. I'm not too worried. Whereas a few years ago, I might have written a book or begun to write a book or at least an essay on the fall of man and this plight. I don't think we're in that stage anymore. I think that globalization has made us more aware. And your story, I've heard plenty like that with the situation with Brene Brown and the father that came up to her later. And that's profound. And I think men are having a lot of profound experiences where there's men watching us right now, aren't there?
I would hope so.
You never know.
I would hope
doing this in a vacuum?
No. But I think whether they're watching now live or there's a couple watching now live. Thank you. I know it's during the day, so it's hard to get folks to sit here for 2 hours, or close to. But I think his larger point was women in society and in all these, and I'll bring it back to what the Russians tried to do in communism. So they created
back to that.
Hang on. So the U.S. Yes. In essence, because there's just a lot of similarities. Okay. The USSR they wanted to build a big house, right? This was the whole idea. They built a big house, and under the Soviet banner of they would have to start a what do you call it? Each one of the various republics under the banner of the Soviet of the USSR would have their own room in the house. So their language would be part of the larger language system. Their culture would be looked at and treated as special and interesting. Their alphabet would be brought in. Now, they did that to some. They didn't do it to others. Whatever. There's a whole logical thing there. But that was the idea, at least on paper. But the only guys who didn't get their own special room were the Russians. So the Russians got the hallway. Well, they're like, well, of course the Russians are going to rule the house because they run the USSR. And yet they were overlooked when all the other particular special cultures got their own little place. So they all got their little cubby holes to exist in and to say this thing is ours. And the Russians sort of got everything, but really got nothing, or sort of got nothing at the same.
I see.
So
I see what you're saying.
What it means to be
discounted,
a man in this society right now, where it's like, well, you're a white man in society. What are you complaining about? You've got everything you need, right? The whole society is bent to advantage you. Well, that's an easy broad brush thing to say, but everybody has their own lot in life. Everybody has their own cross to bear. Everybody has that. And one of the taboos is still talking about men's vulnerability and issues and mental health issues. It's very interesting to say, and it's kind of interesting, Pride Month, and I don't know if this is true or not, so we will look this up, but Pride Month used to be Men's Mental Health Month. And that was rebranded, let's say, Pride Month. Assuming for the sake of argument that that's correct. And we will look that up to make sure that it is.
Well, if that is the case, then that's, it's an oversight, it's overlooking, it's discounting, it's very deliberate if that's the case.
Well, those two things exist, like they're both things that should be looked at, right? I'm not saying one's better than another. Yeah. All I'm saying is they both deserve to be looked at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, then again, we have these months for different groups. It's a reparations in effect that we have a month, like Black History Month.
That's an interesting point.
That culture should be celebrated all the time. I mean, that's often the argument, right? To have a month, it's like, it's only important to learn about like Black history in February. Like, you should always be learning about it, right? Or like Pride Month, like that we give. You know what? That's what we do in this country, right? It's why Christopher Columbus, I mean, you know how that whole story with the 1920s and Columbus Day, and there was a lot of hate against Italians at the time, and so we decided that Christopher Columbus was an Italian explorer.
Well, he was originally from Genoa. I mean, he was an Italian.
Genoa, but he sailed for Portugal.
He sailed for Spain.
Yeah.
He sailed for Spain. He first went to Portugal.
They said, go take a hike. Yeah, absolutely.
He went to their enemies, and then he sailed for Spain.
Correct. He sailed for Isabella.
Over fun to tell.
Isabella, yeah.
Yes.
And then he had a Templar cross on his flag.
That's another thing. So we started to talk about that in the Hogan episode to some extent.
We talked with Grandmaster Hogan in person about
Very interesting dude, is he not? Everybody watch that podcast.
He's a great one for sure.
Episode 4.
Episode 4, 1 and 2.
2 parts. There's 2 parts.
It's a two-parter.
Yeah. Any opportunity to meet or talk to or be a pupil of that guy is not an opportunity.
Interesting dude. Yeah, no doubt.
Sure. So we try to make reparations, and we often miss the mark. Really, all people should be celebrated and validated, but you can't deny that this country was. It's just the course of history. It's not because I mean we do dip into some like hot button issues when we have this conversation, like critical race theory, et cetera, talking about institutional racism. I mean that's really delicate stuff, and I don't want to get you guys shadow banned.
No. It's an interesting thing. Critical race theory, of course, comes from the Frankfurt School. So Frankfurt School was a lot of the folks that came over after World War II.
Yeah.
Where you had some philosophers. And I think it starts with a good idea. Socratic approach, question everything, right?
That's right. Fundamentally,
I may disagree with the conclusions that they come to.
And I often disagree with conclusions, but the problem is coming to a conclusion.
Yes.
When you use Socratic method, you're really just supposed to have conversation and explore. It's when you come to a conclusion that says, like, ultimately, ubiquitously, this is what is.
Because now that leads to a new stagnation, right? That's a conversation ender, not a conversation.
Right. Now we're just complacent. We're okay with the fact that, and in the next 100 years, it's going to be white men that are downtrodden, although very unlikely, right? Because functionally, this country was founded by, white Western men, and so it was founded with their principles and values in mind.
To a certain extent, I mean, you could say that, but it was really founded by very disaffected extremists, which really is why this country, I think, not mine, maybe yours.
Forefathers as Masons.
Well, in a sense, also, but don't forget that those guys. I was talking about the Pilgrims.
So
the Pilgrims are well, the Dutch and the English as well. But you're talking about a group that was, I oftentimes joke with my friends who are in the Mayflower Society, which I think is such a whole thing. But I said, you guys should have had a bumper sticker on the Mayflower that said, too annoying for Europe. Because, they came over, they were really extremists. I mean, they wanted their own specific, that's a saying, and I'm not probably going to get in trouble for this, but that's like saying Branch Davidians started the U.S. Right. Obviously they were not that, but they were extremists of their day, right? So they were not well looked at in England, not wanted in England.
During my existential crises, and I was reading, I also read Dianetics too.
Who wouldn't, right? I read Dianetics as well, and
but ultimately, I obviously came back to this place where I'm a monistic pantheist. I believe that.
God bless you.
Thank you. Yes. All is divine and all is one. We're all talking about the same thing. We're all connected. So really, if we relate it back to gender, if we relate it back to men's roles, as we move through society, we get from. So why did we separate ultimately? I'm talking about from like a theological, anthropological perspective. It's when we got more specific. It's when we created dogma and doctrine. It's when we got more specific, created rules for each other, condemned behaviors, etc. When we got more specific, when we moved away from golden rule and maybe a collection of commandments that are simple and make sense, I think that what that did was it gave juxtapositions of power. Where I am holy and you're sinful, right? Or I am devout or I'm chosen and you're heathen. And instinctually, human beings, I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking about the uncanny valley, the cognitive dissonance that's created when you see something or someone that resembles you so closely and yet they're somewhat different. Well, in our history, I mean, we evolved amongst many other species of near humans, of bipedal primates, cognitive bipedal primates, and we either intermated with them to some degree, or just killed them. And for the most part, we killed them. And we killed them because
How do we know that?
It's throughout archaeology and anthropology, it's pretty widely accepted that we killed out all these other species. They dropped off pretty abruptly. And I believe there's evidence of Homo sapiens.
I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there weren't fights between, but to say that there were genocides is saying something else.
Well, I know I'm not going so far as to say genocides, because I think that one of those groups would have to have superior power to actually enact a genocide. But they were at war. They were competing over resources, or believed to be competing over resources, right? And so they fought. Well, I believe, and I know that there's literature in my field that also suggests that racism and hatred, right, and the differences that we see ethnically and physiologically, and any hate that is drummed up from those differences we see, is an instinctual fear. It's fear that that person will take our job, or take food off our plate, or take our wives or our mate or our children, right? It's a fear fundamentally. And that fear is useful to a certain percentage of the population. It keeps us under control, where we war against each other, and instead of realizing who ultimately has the strings on.
So what you're saying is what was at one point an atavistic, natural fear is now a manufactured fear.
All right, yes. Yes.
Are we going into adrenochrome right now? Is that what's happening?
No. Let me give you a couple of examples.
I'm not ready to embrace the cue just
We're
yet.
not going there.
All right, thank you.
We're not going there at all. Nor would I go there. But I want to talk a little bit about some common mental health diagnoses and their evolutionary psychological roots. So let's start with the concept of seasonal depression, right? We're aware of what seasonal depression is. Your energy level is lower in winter months. You're not as social. You don't have as much drive or motivation to be out there generating, being productive. Well, what animal doesn't do that? That was adaptive until turn of the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution and the light bulb. Now our robber baron capitalists expect us to produce even into sunset. Expect us to wake up before the sun rises because we have electric light bulbs. And why shouldn't we be starting our day and producing? So we created a disorder called seasonal depression to say that you're deviant. There's something wrong with you, that you instinctually want to use less energy and conserve energy in winter months, consume less, socialize less. That was adaptive for hundreds of thousands of years, arguably millions of years. And now all of a sudden, as of the last 130 years, all of a sudden it's maladaptive now. Let's talk about the concept of anxiety, right? We're talking a lot about fear. Fear is not a bad thing. Fear keeps you from dying. I'm not arguing that our amygdala should be shut off in any way. Fear of death or harm is good for us, right? Back when edifices weren't as fortified, it would make sense for us to be afraid of climbing to the top of one. But should you feel fear when you drive over the George Washington Bridge?
That it might fall or something like that?
I mean, what are people experiencing? What are phobias really? Phobias are, we call them fears, right? But they're really anxieties. Fear is a healthy response to something that can harm you. Anxiety is an unhealthy, maladaptive response, fear response, to something that can't or won't likely harm you, that instead inhibits your ability to function in society. So these disorders, right, anxiety, for example, it's not to say that they're not real. They're real. They're not fabricated, but they're functions of societal changes, right? We're now safe. And yet the parts of our brain that control fear are still there. Our society and our technology has evolved way more rapidly than our cognition and than our brains and our physiology. So there are still these relics of the past, like vestigial appendages, for example, right? I mean, do we need our appendix? Who's eating raw meat? You eat raw meat.
I eat raw meat.
You look like a guy who eats raw meat.
I eat raw meat.
Well, so then you might need your appendix, although I don't really think it functions in that capacity anymore.
Yeah, I thought it was for sorting out seeds or something like that. It was like
Appendix?
seed-based something, yeah.
I think appendix
Like some enzymes, certain
Your
enzymes.
enzymes to process the proteins that are now cooked out of meats.
You know what my acupuncturist told me?
What?
He said that if you focus on your,
He said you've got holes where you shouldn't.
after that,
Oh boy.
he said that if you focus on your tailbone,
Okay.
right? So that's
Your own?
focus on your own tailbone.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. And if you that is a vestigial tail, right?
Yeah,
I'll call it that. So if you energetically think about wagging your tail, it will actually improve your mood.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I believe it. I mean, they have a lot of experiments about phantom limb and where people are actually, well, but doesn't that talks about mind over matter, right?
Right.
It talks about the fact that with your mind, with the power of your own psyche and your ability to control your will, you can affect your health. You can affect your mood. That's the whole goal of most of Eastern medicine, is to help people take more control over their energy. So that sounds right on par with all that.
Right on par.
You wagging your tail right now?
Maybe.
I don't want to know.
Yeah. No, I would be. This is really cool. This is a really awesome opportunity to have these conversations and get them out there. I think, if my goal was to expand the breadth of my impact and get more people curious about ways that they can improve their life, improve their role in society, and have a positive impact on each other, no better way to do it than joining you guys here. So maybe I got to hit up Brene Brown and see if she can get me on TED Talk.
There you go. Aside from fear, anxiety, depression, the seasonal depression, are there any particular things that affect women versus men or vice versa? Or is it universal?
So there's a couple of interesting ideas here. So there are congenital mental health disorders that certain families are more likely to inherit. There are also mental health disorders that you're more likely to see in one sex or the other. Notice I'm not saying gender, sex. I'm talking specifically about biological men versus biological women.
XX versus XY.
Yeah, because gender is mutually exclusive. Sexual preference is mutually exclusive from gender, is mutually exclusive from biological sex, etc. Right? All those things, you could throw them up in the air and get any combination.
All right.
That's what I'm saying. They're not dependent on each other. So there are certain mental health disorders that are more common. That might just be statistically more common, still within the bell curve, in one sex versus the other. But I think what we've realized, I know what we've realized in recent years is there's certain mental health diagnoses that folks in my field were just poor at diagnosing in different sexes, in different genders, based on societal expectations. For example, autism and ADHD. It was fairly easy to see autism in males for a long time. We still struggle to spot autism in females.
Well, Temple Grandin and other such.
Well, right. So Temple Grandin, a phenomenal spokesperson for developmental impairment.
Lightning round.
Great. Hit me. So in the cases of autism spectrum disorder, which now encompasses pervasive developmental disorder, what used to be called Asperger's, it's harder now to spot that in girls, in females in general. And there's suggestions that the reason is because girls are a lot more likely, while boys will dissent, right? They will argue and tussle with each other and jockey for power. Girls want to fit in. And so it's really important for them to figure out the scripts early on for how they can fit in with their clique, or a clique, so they're not ostracized in any way. And that makes it really hard to spot autism.
Cool.
Yeah. ADHD is getting more easy to spot.
But what you're saying on some level is that we have the capacity not to function autistically in that sense, based on cultural need.
I declassify students that have IEPs because even though their diagnosis hasn't changed, they've learned how to adapt and catch up to and keep up with their general education peers, despite their inherent or starting disability. They had to work a little extra hard, but ultimately they can catch up and no longer need special education. Well, it's the plasticity of the brain, right? I mean, it's not just the plasticity of the brain, but plasticity of the soul, right? If you have will to achieve something, right? If a person has will to achieve something, well, it's a hell of a lot more likely that they will.
Right.
So then modalities like IEP and all that stuff can oftentimes be a trap. Could be a crutch begins as a crutch, but then becomes something that you struggle to get out of at some point.
So there's a goal in my field. The goal in my field is to determine the most clinically responsible decision, right? So our goal is to hit a window where we're meeting need, but not over-serving a population and thusly creating a crutch, making them dependent. So the goal, and I work on a phenomenal team in Chester School District. I've learned a ton since joining the team a few years ago, where we really see when there's need, and the moment there's no longer need, or the moment where we can reduce the level of intervention to a less restrictive intervention, we do that, and those kids adapt and prosper, and we often have kids that wind up being declassified, or at least move from a more restrictive environment like a resource replacement classroom where they're taken out of the class to an inclusion classroom where they can interact with gen ed peers and be a peer role model, receive modeled peer behavior, and there maybe is just a special education teacher in the same room with them. They don't even identify that those are the special education kids anymore. Those teachers help all the kids, and they work together. It's beautiful. It's how I wish it was in the 90s when I was going into school. Mm-hmm. They identified me. I was like 4 years old, and they gave me a test and then recognized my IQ, and they pushed me forward. And I was like, he'll do fine. Well, yeah, I got straight A's. I graduated number 6 in my class. I got a full academic scholarship to college, but socially, I was always behind. So I'm not going to push my son forward. I'm going to hold him back. I'm going to let him be a little bit older in his grade because boys mature a little bit later than girls do. Maybe, who knows what would have been. It doesn't matter. I'm so grateful for the life that I have, but who knows what it would have looked like for me if I had been in the middle or a little bit older in my grade. Who knows? Maybe I'd be having this podcast.
And then for
I don't know if you'd be that cool.
No, I don't think I'd be that cool.
Probably not. But from the ADD, ADHD perspective,
Sure.
I've seen some videos recently where they state it doesn't really exist. It's just because boys are more active, they're hyperactive. You have sugar being injected into kids nowadays.
Yeah, I see those videos.
They're kind of bouncing off the walls. What would you say to that?
Okay, so what I would say to that, in the same vein as the conversation before about some of these diagnoses and disorders that were created, because again, in the Middle Ages, middle-aged medieval England, they weren't talking about somebody with a lot of energy as having ADHD, right? Or a person who was autistic or maybe severely cognitively impaired as having severe cognitive impairment. What they were doing is they were just killing that person, right? Or sequestering that person or isolating that person or whatever. They were the town fool. It was awful. It was inhumane. That was happening pretty much all the way up until Geraldo Rivera busted, Willowbrook in Staten Island in the 80s. But they were mistreating people with cognitive impairment and developmental disability. Actually, the organization that I worked for in New York City, YAI, Young Adult Institute, National Institute of People with Disabilities, was they received all of those Willowbrook patients, clients, and helped them rehabilitate to some degree. But I saw trauma in 80-year-old people from their time in Willowbrook.
Same with what our psychic friend was telling us about Greystoke and some of those.
When I was a kid, I used to break into the catacombs of Greystone.
Yeah, so
we used to go to Greystone all the time too.
well,
we're in New Jersey, like exploring there.
There's a Potter's Field in Morristown Cemetery.
Evergreen Cemetery.
Evergreen Cemetery that has what used to say undesirables that were sent initially to Greystone and then disposed of. In essence, back in the 1800s, I'm talking about.
A lot of them were mistresses and other unwanted individuals in society.
Or somebody that made somebody else's life complicated.
Right.
Right. I mean, how awful that was commonplace up until 100 and so years ago.
Right. The elites were able to just sweep it under the rug and say, okay.
Not like that
You're gone.
doesn't happen to some extent now, right?
Maybe.
Just gotten more clever.
Perhaps.
But,
The narrative being what it is.
but your question was ADHD. Why is it that kids are being diagnosed with ADHD? It's because the way that the Rockefeller education system is structured, where we're trying to make productive workers that can follow rules.
Excuse me, Henry Ford education system.
Well, yeah,
He designed the
Henry Ford,
Right.
was through Rockefeller. The idea is that we want people to be able to comply and follow rules and respond to bells.
to be factory workers, good shift workers. Yes,
Yeah, it's Henry Ford's idea. So these kids with ADHD, they have a lot more trouble fitting that mold, right? ADHD, I mean, I have ADHD. So
Same here.
Yeah, me too.
I think it's a superpower. I was never medicated. My grandfather he had me at the tennis courts all the time. I was in activities. I was always busy. I was studying. I was skateboarding. I was playing instruments. I was doing art. I was doing all kinds of stuff. So that might work for some kids, but I also had an intellectual capacity to be able to do all those things. Not every kid does.
Sure.
So again, another example of these diagnoses being real, but really they're a function of societal expectations. You don't fit this mold. There's some places where kids with ADHD would prosper. How are we on time?
We're good, but we should hit the lightning round pretty
We
soon.
have about 8 minutes remaining.
Okay, perfect.
In terms of, the lightning round, one thing I wanted to ask you, obviously there's so many people today that face relationship issues. Marriage, clearly, it seems like the divorce rate consistently goes up.
Yeah.
How would you say somebody could resolve issues in relationships? Just high level, obviously, there's so many different variations of things, whether it's,
I'll try to be,
cheating, whether it's, people bullying each other or whatever else, just in general.
So, not to beat a dead horse, but cheating and a lot of conflict that comes out of relationships is a result of fear, right? Most people who cheat or are suspicious have some degree of guilt or shame, right? And vice versa. Most people who, who cheat, or have been cheated on, I mean, they go hand in hand. It's usually insecurities and fears that generate a lot of that stuff. And when people can't handle that stuff and be real about it, be honest about it, and trust their partner and talk to their partner about those things, they figure out other ways to cope. We could have had a whole other conversation on negative coping skills, because a lot of the work that I've done in my career has to do with negative coping skills. So as I'm looking at the glasses of Scotch and cigars on the table, everything within due bounds, right? Circumscribe all passions. But the idea is that if you're coping to avoid, right? I play D&D, I play games, or I, go on hikes to avoid. I'm not really avoiding my struggles, right? I'm still tackling my struggles head on, but I'm decompressing in that way. If you use your coping mechanisms to avoid handling your problems, then they're not going anywhere. You're just delaying the inevitable and worsening them. So that happens in relationships.
So from that perspective, if you're using coping mechanisms, then that means you would never heal. So
If you're using coping mechanisms as a way to avoid dealing with the problem, then it's a lot less likely that you're going to heal. Absolutely.
so then how could our viewers heal if that was the case instead of using a coping mechanism?
Well, the process of therapy is incredibly difficult for some people. Folks in my field often say you either spend an immense amount of effort looking at yourself, breaking yourself down, understanding your flaws, being receptive to others' feedback, seeing what did or didn't work in your life, and rebuilding yourself as a better person, or you spend the same amount of effort freeing yourself from responsibility, guilt, and blame, and pointing the finger in every other direction and justifying your behavior in whatever capacity and explaining that other people are wrong about you or everybody's out to get you. There's some very unhealthy people in this world, some in positions of power.
My only quibble with that is it sets up a this or that, which is not, I think, the only totality of
This
what
or
it
that
is.
being
therapy or not.
Yeah, no. So therapy is not the only answer.
Right.
realize that therapy is also a really vague term. It doesn't just mean one-on-one counseling with a person. Therapy could be naturalism, could be hiking. Therapy could be a hobby that's therapeutic. Therapy could be Dungeons and Dragons with your friends.
While you're surreptitiously therapizing your,
in that case,
your player characters.
You get a lot of quality for your.
Yeah, I guess you do. One of the things, Dr. Freddie Starr, who was on here last time around, we're going to go do brain scans with him, which is going to be pretty funny.
It?
Yeah.
I'd love to see mine.
So, yeah, well, we were wondering which one of our brains was going to be better used for the overall, like which one's going to light up funnier or something like that.
Who's more messed up in the head?
Right. So he's got some physical trauma from his younger years because of sports. I've got all kinds of emotional and mental trauma and other stuff from past experiences.
So we know the answer already.
Well, it'll be one of the two. It'll be interesting to see.
I'm just going to put a hypothesis out there that it's Alex.
So, one of our
didn't Fred Starr say therapy is not the answer?
Well, it's not that he said that, because he sort of walked, not that he walked it back, but he was grateful for the fact that he was going to be able to explain better what he meant by that. What he said was it's good for certain things. If you follow a CBD workbook, a cognitive behavioral therapy workbook, CBT,
while you're using CBD,
maybe while you're using CBD. And you do all the exercises and you really put your all into it, it will help you. It's a modality that can help.
It's changing your internal schemas.
But is it the best? Is it the best for that? I went through years of therapy for various things. Did it ultimately help me? To some extent around the edges it did, but did it deal with core issues? No.
Alex, just like there's a lot of bad electricians out there that'll do a shoddy job, there's plenty of bad therapists.
Oh, yeah.
You have to, plenty of people with stories about being in therapy for a long time. My mom was in therapy for 30 years with the same psychiatrist to treat her OCD. It's worse than it's ever been.
Wow.
Maybe try somebody else, right?
Well, the other thing is that it opens you up to certain things like gaslighting and other things like that, or giving that therapist too much control over you in how you're then, everything you do in your life is now run by that therapist.
We are guided by ethics, and we should never be in a position where we have countertransference. And when we realize that there's boundary conflicts, we're supposed to ethically terminate. We're supposed to set firm boundaries. I mean, there's really a process that's been created that should be followed really concisely by ethical practitioners. And we're required, I have to have 40 credited hours of continuing education every 2 years to renew my license. That should guide my practice.
Vince says, one of our listeners says, having ADHD myself, it always felt like being a square block forced into a circular hole in certain situations. Insightful discussions. Well done, Jones. Thank you very much.
Yeah, actually, I agreed with that. This is my experience.
So before we go,
okay,
just one last little tip.
I thought I wouldn't have enough content for you guys.
So, now I'm afraid. What's he going to talk about?
Pornography.
Now? Oh, pornography.
Is it a coping mechanism, or what exactly is porn addiction?
Okay, so like any addiction, it's about releasing dopamine, right? So same thing with phone addiction, gambling. It's about triggering a response. And the people who were consulted with when developing Facebook, Reels, and Instagram and TikTok, they were mental health professionals to help the programmers devise a way to tap into sort of our inherent cognitive capacities so that it could get you coming back time and time again.
So these were ethical folks that were specifically doing unethical things.
Yeah, well, some of the I watched a video recently of a couple of Facebook executives who actually left for that reason when they realized how dangerous it was and that people were being taken advantage of. So in the same vein as any other addiction, you're coping, you're avoiding, you're triggering dopamine release, and you're not going to move away from that. You're only going to lean into that more. If what you're looking for is again, you're talking to somebody who was a therapist for juvenile sex offenders, many of whom who had unhealthy pornography addictions. Is your question about the people or about the industry? Because one of the big problems is that there's a lot of deviant behavior in pornography, violent behavior that leads young people or not young people to believe that that's typical or the way that it should be. And that's damaging to relationships.
Yeah, I was talking more about the people, not the industry.
Well, the people, like any addiction, get out in the world and socialize, right? Go be a human being, go participate in society, meet people, make your own, just be a human. Be a human and live life.
You heard it here, folks. Make your own porn.
Make your own porn.
I'm a respected member of my community.
You were.
I was. What happens when I hang out with you guys?
Until the dungeon came into play.
Not that kind of dungeon master.
Well, you never know.
You're not going to end on that note, right?
No.
We don't have any more time, ladies and gentlemen.
We'll talk about butterflies real quick or something.
Yeah, please. All right, let me talk about butterflies for a moment. Here's a great way to do it. Plant some native plants in your backyard. Go spend time in your backyard. Attract pollinators and butterflies and bees. Sit in nature. Unplug, disconnect, and then reconnect with what will really recharge you. And I think that's the first step. To moving us into a higher level of emotional frequency. I think that's it.
Brandon, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. Appreciate everything.
Thank you, brother.
See you guys.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dave, for once again doing this with me. It's always a good time, a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
And we're on that note, we will see you guys soon.
And
Thanks
God
again.
bless America. God bless all.
Absolutely. God bless America.
Arcana.
Thanks, everybody.
Brothers of the Arcana. We are indeed. All right.